welcome everyone to Voices Presents. We have a little bit of a spin this month on our regular fall solutions themes with some real practical solutions. We thought everyone could use a little bit of optimism going into the new year. So we have Adam Dorr joining us. Adam is the Director of Research at the independent think tank Rethink X. His team has been a substantial impact, his team's work has had a substantial impact on global policymaking, investment, and public understanding around new technologies in energy, transportation, and food sectors. He's an environmental social scientist and technology theorist whose publications have focused on understanding the dynamics of energy, transportation, and food disruptions and their implications for climate change. Adam is a passionate advocate for optimism and progress and completed his MS at the University of Michigan School for the Environment and Sustainability and his PhD at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam for his presentation on brighter optimism, progress, and the future of environmentalism. But just a quick note before we get started to put any questions you have as they come along through the presentation in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and Molly will be moderating them and posing those to Adam after his presentation. All right, thanks. Turning it over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate everyone taking the time and appreciate your interest. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can show slides with everybody. Let me see if I can get that working. So bear with me for just a moment. Yes, as Bridget said, I am the Director of Research for an independent think tank, Rethink X, whose focus is on understanding the implications of new disruptive technologies. And this book, which is launching on Monday, it's not available yet, but it will be shortly, just in time for Christmas. It pulls together a lot of the threads that have formed the basis of my work over the last 5 years. And as you can see from the title, Brighter Optimism, Progress, and the Future of Environmentalism, my outlook has become extremely hopeful and optimistic as I've learned more and more over the last 5 years with Rethink X about what lies ahead of us technologically and how these extraordinary new tools can equip us to solve some of our most formidable environmental problems, to meet these huge challenges that we face, including climate change. I've become extraordinarily encouraged by what is going to be possible in the near future, not 200 years or 100 years or 50 years from now, but just a decade or two from now. So I've become extremely confident and bullish about the scope of technology to help us solve some of our problems in the environmental space. And that is really what this book is about. And that's what I'll talk through today. I'll try to lay out why I think technology disruptions really are a fundamental key for us to use to solve these major challenges that we face. So let me walk through the reasoning behind this and then lay out the case for disruption in general, and then the specific disruptions that we are going to see over the next 10 to 15 years, okay? So to start with, we have to sort of see where we are today. And where we are today is that human progress and prosperity has come at a terrible cost to the natural world. This is something that we all know and feel and deeply understand, especially those of us who are environmentalists who are active in this space. This is a fact, an incontrovertible fact. But what follows from that fact is a prescription, a response, how we ought to take action, recognizing the terrible situation that we're in. And the major thread, the major narrative that I see dominating most environmental discourse is that our only option is to cut back and to downgrade and shrink, to retreat from this challenge and our problems, and hope that if we make these cutbacks and we degrow ourselves as a civilization, and that includes us as individuals, cutting back on our lifestyles, making conscientious choices and so forth, that this is the path to solving these problems. And I've become very, very much convinced by the evidence that I've assessed that that strategy is not practical, that it can't work. And that in itself is very discouraging. And I believe that a key reason why pessimism is so widespread is that most of us know this in our bones, including the scientific community. We know and we recognize and we feel that this can't really work. That cutting back, doing a bit less of what got us into trouble in the first place isn't really a formula for success. And I'll talk about that with an analogy in just a moment. A thing that follows on directly from this is that if we were to try to make this a solution, to cut back, to downgrade, to shrink, especially to shrink our economy, it would create a social catastrophe. We all just saw that the pandemic created a terrible recession, one of the worst in living memory. But just for context, worldwide, globally, and the pandemic was a global phenomenon, and a global recession resulted from it. We only saw a decline of about 5% in the scale of the global economy. So production, consumption that goes along with it, those only declined a little bit during the recession, and it was still terrible. Almost 500 million people lost their jobs worldwide. It was catastrophic for many households, many communities, many entire regions, and it was temporary, but it was still terrible. If we were to cut back 50% instead of 5% like we saw during the recession, one can imagine the impact that would have. It would be a catastrophe. And so we would be exchanging an ecological catastrophe for a social one. And that is not really a solution to our problems either. So the analogy that I use to describe the situation is a house on fire. So if we are standing and looking at our house and it's on fire, what should we do? Right? Well, it's obvious that the first thing we should do is put out the flames. We should extinguish the flames. That's the first step. But that's not enough. Your problem isn't solved when you've extinguished the blaze. You still have to do all of the repair work. You have to fix everything that was damaged. And you have to upgrade the house and ensure that a catastrophe like that can't happen again, that it can't catch fire again. So you're not done just when you put out the flames. That's the thing to take away from the house on fire analogy. And by this analogy, the way to think about the conventional story of solving environmental problems is, well, that thinking is it's like thinking, well, if we just extinguish half of the fire, if we just cut back 50%, or maybe even more, 75%, even 90%, well, that will be sustainable. But that's kind of crazy, right? It's like thinking that if you put out 90% of a fire, you've saved your burning building. And that just isn't the case. And so our world is on fire right now, especially when we think about climate change. And so we have to solve the entire problem. And we can't do that just by cutting back a bit on the things that created the problem in the first place. We have to do something completely different. So that's what I want to talk about. Okay, so what I argue and what has emerged out of my work at RethinkX, what I argue in the book, is that the only real way to solve our environmental problems is with progress and prosperity. And this is really the way that we've solved all problems throughout history, personal problems and social problems, right? If we lack prosperity, whether in our personal lives or collectively, it makes it extremely difficult to solve our problems. Prosperity is normally the key. It's normally the enabling condition for solving our problems. Okay, so what does that mean in this situation? What has to change? What progress do we need to make in order to become prosperous enough to meet these challenges? Well, that's where technology comes in. That's where the technology is really key. And what's been lacking so far is understanding exactly how technology can play a role in solving our problems. I should emphasize, technology isn't a magic wand, right? It isn't that technology will automatically and perfectly solve our problems. It's that it is the tool we need in our tool belt in order to have a realistic shot at solving our problems. So it is a necessary condition. It's not necessarily sufficient in itself, but it's definitely an essential part of the solution, in my view. Okay, so where are we with technology? What is going on that's made me so optimistic? Well, these are the things to think about. I believe we're on the cusp of the most profound transformation of the global economy in over a century, because 4 foundational sectors, pillars of civilization, really, will be disrupted by technology. And disruption changes everything. It changes the game completely. Okay, so let me lay out what disruption is and why I think this is what's coming. So what is disruption? I'll start with a fun example. This is Fifth Avenue in New York City in the year 1900. So one of the founders of Rethink X, Tony Seba, often starts his presentations with this slide. This is his wonderful example. Where is the car in this scene of Fifth Avenue in the year 1900? There's only one. It's right there in the middle, circled now. That's just the one. All of the rest are horse and buggy. But 13 years later, this is Fifth Avenue in New York. Where is the horse? Again, there's only one. 13 years and a complete transformation. Now, we used horses for thousands of years for our mobility. And yet it did not take a century to make the transition, to transform our transportation system from horses to automobiles. In the places where it was adopted, the adoption proceeded very quickly, within just a couple of decades. For a system as large as transportation itself, right, that's not a little thing. And for something that had existed for thousands of years up until that point. So being a big system and being an old system is no protection from technology disruption. So this is the pattern that we see again and again and again throughout history. Again and again, we see an S-shaped pattern where things start off slowly. New technologies take a while to emerge. They're not that great to begin with. They start out being expensive, and they have bugs and quirks and things that aren't perfect. And so the adoption of them is slow at first, but it accelerates. It takes off in the early stages, and you get a period of what looks like exponential growth of the new technology and the new system that emerges around that new technology, new industries and new ways of thinking and new ways of doing things. And this can happen at lots of different levels. It can happen at the level, you can have a disruption at the level of an individual market or industry. You can have a disruption at the level of an entire sector of the economy, or even society as a whole. We've seen this many, many different examples, and they all follow this same S-shaped pattern. Start out slowly, accelerate very quickly, and then slow down again as you approach saturation. And a new normal sets in. A new paradigm takes hold and then is stable for a while, waiting for the next disruption. We see this again and again and again. And what's extraordinary is that the disruptions don't take generations. They almost always just take a decade or two. And as the new system is growing, the old system, the old technologies, the old industries built on them collapse. They are wiped out. Now, we've seen this again and again. Here are a few examples. You don't need to be able to see the slides. The text might be a bit small, so don't worry if you can't see these. This is just for purposes of illustration. We see the same fundamental pattern again and again for all kinds of different things. Things as different as fabric dyes are from carpenter's nails, as different as coal is from car tires, as different as insulin is from cameras. We see the same dynamics, the same fundamental pattern again and again and again. Here's an example of literally a textbook case of technology disruption. Film cameras being disrupted by digital cameras. If you're my age or older, I'm in my 40s, I can remember this, I can vividly remember this happening starting in the mid-1990s. Up until about 1995, when the first consumer digital cameras became available that were affordable, film was how you took pictures. And you bought rolls of film and you took them to the 1 hour photo and had them developed, and that was how you took photographs. But boy, did things change fast, right? The film cameras, that entire industry collapsed, and the digital camera industry took off. Kodak was the titan of the photography industry for more than a century. And it even had digital cameras itself and a number of key patents on those technologies. And that wasn't enough to save them, because they didn't embrace the disruption. They resisted, they held out hope that film cameras would hang in there, would not be wiped out. They were wrong, and a decade later, Kodak was bankrupt. Now, another thing to show here is that this is market share. This is not the size of the market. So this is a percentage, right? Film cameras as a percentage decline, digital cameras as a percentage increase. But percentages, they just add up to 100, right? Market share is not the same as market size. At the same time that the disruption was happening, the whole market for photography was growing, because digital cameras were much cheaper and much easier for more people to use in more places. And so digital cameras, as the disruption happened, created a market for photography, for imaging, that was much larger than the original market that they disrupted. So this is another pattern that we see again and again and again. And an interesting thing about digital cameras in particular is that it didn't stop with just digital cameras, devices that were just a camera, because smartphones then came along and disrupted the digital cameras themselves. So digital cameras, although they grew much larger than film cameras, they were just a blip compared to smartphones, which came right on their heels. So there was a disruption and then another disruption right away. And we see that again and again throughout history too. Okay, so one might ask, why do these happen so fast? How do disruptions happen so fast? Why doesn't this take 100 years? What's the reason to expect that big industries like the fossil fuel industry won't linger on and hold in there for another 100 years? Well, it's to do with the dynamics of what drive all technology disruptions. And I've got this is a diagram that we use in my work. It's pretty involved. I'll just talk about some of the big features of it. I won't talk through every detail of it because there's a lot in here, but I'll describe just sort of the overarching picture, the main dynamics of it. So really what it is, what drives disruptions to happen so fast, the new technologies to grow so quickly and the new ones to collapse so quickly, is because it's all about feedback loops. It's all about virtuous cycles and vicious cycles. That's what's going on. That's what makes disruptions happen so fast, as opposed to just slowly and incrementally and linearly. They accelerate, they explode once they get going. And the reason why is captured in the logic of this diagram. On the side with the new technology, you have feedback loops that just accelerate and accelerate and accelerate, like a flywheel spinning up, right? As costs of the new technology fall, demand for that technology rises, and then that suddenly, if there's demand, then you get all kinds of support from the government, investment from industries. Looks like there's more money in it. So hey, well, all of that new investment expands the supply, and when you scale and expand the supply of an industry, well, your costs fall even further, and you get economies of scale benefits. You tend to get improvements in quality, and the public becomes more accepting. And all of these things just feed on one another in a virtuous cycle, looping around and accelerating. And that's why we see an accelerating pattern in the adoption of new technologies. At the same time that cycle is running, more demand, more supply, costs falling, more money, more investment, and so forth, spinning up. Well, the exact reverse is happening to the old technology and the industries built around the old technology. As demand for their older products and services falls, they experience exactly the opposite. Everything shrinks. Support gets withdrawn. Investment dries up. And then the supply of those things falls. They experience the reverse of economies of scale. The public can start to pull back as well and say, hey, we're not going to put up with the things that we were putting up with before. We see this in fossil fuels right now and in combustion engine vehicles. We're not going to put up with pollution. We're not going to put up with emissions. We're not going to put up with the nasty side effects of these older technologies now that a new alternative looks like it's emerging. And so public acceptance tends to be withdrawn. All of that feeds back in a loop as well. But that's not a virtuous cycle. That's a vicious cycle. And we sometimes call that a death spiral. So these two things are going on simultaneously, and they feed into one another. More demand for the old means less demand for the new, right? The new technology eats into the demand for the old. And so this diagram captures those fundamental dynamics and explains why, for so many different kinds of products and services throughout history, we've seen disruptions happen so quickly. Okay, so what are the disruptions today that are so exciting, that offer the possibility for us to solve some of our most intractable environmental challenges, like climate change? Well, there are three major ones that my research team has looked into. Energy, and the key technologies here are solar power, wind power, and battery energy storage. These aren't the only clean energy technologies. They're not the only renewables, and there are lots of ways to store energy, so batteries aren't the only energy storage game in town, but these three are the key. They're the ones that are cheap and getting cheaper, and that makes all the difference. The second is transportation. So transportation is being disrupted as we speak by electric vehicles. It's kind of hard to open the news and not see something about that. And also by autonomous or self-driving technology. That's another key technology that's converging with electric vehicles to offer a new way to be mobile that is cheaper and cleaner and more convenient and offers just much better value, and is therefore spells disruption for the older modes of transportation. And the third sector that's going to be disrupted is the food sector. And this has already started. It's at an earlier stage than the other two. Food is lagging a few years behind. Food is not as far along in its disruption. It's not as far along up that S curve as energy is, for example. But a few years from now, 3, 4, 5 years from now, we'll really be tearing up that S curve in a big way. And we're already starting to see this. So I'll talk about each of these three disruptions in detail. And then there is a fourth one. And that is the disruption of labor. And I'll talk about that a little bit at the very end, just very briefly. Okay, so let's do energy just real quickly. I'm going to take you through the data. I want to take you through the evidence here, because that is what is really driving all of my work, and what's really driving my optimism is that there is evidence, there's data that support the conclusion that we are looking at momentous change across these three sectors of the economy. Energy to start with. What's going on here in energy? Well, costs are plummeting. And I'm only showing data from 2010. Some of this data could go back further. I could show, solar going back to the 90s, and the fall has been precipitous since then. But this is what we see. We see a steep decline in the new technology. We know that disruptions are driven by economic competitiveness. And so these falling costs are absolutely key. And we can see going forward that costs will continue to fall. There's a floor. They can't fall forever, and they can't fall completely to zero necessarily, but we can see that the trajectory will continue over the next decade or so for each of these technologies. Solar costs were high. Solar power was expensive 10 years ago. But if your talking points are from 10 years ago, you're completely out of date, because the cost has fallen by 90% since then. right? So what was true, solar power and other clean energy can't compete with cheap coal. That was true in 2010. It's not true at all today. So massive decline, and we think there's going to be a continued decline over the course of the 2020s. Okay, so this is a huge, huge transformation. Same with wind power. I'm going to breeze through some of these charts. I don't want to linger on them too long. Same with wind power, not quite as spectacular as the cost improvements in solar, but costs have been falling in wind. Almost half. Costs have fallen almost by half in a decade. And they'll continue to fall over the decade ahead. That's a remarkable transformation. Batteries are probably the standout story here. And the battery technology is interesting because it's shared across so many industries. You know, the same battery technology that's in your smartphone or in your laptop computer is also in an electric car and is also in these huge grid scale battery farms. And so that allows the technology to be deployed and scaled very rapidly because it's across many industries. We've seen a huge cost gains, cost improvements in batteries over the last decade. Again, about 90%. This is just through 2020, and it's continued. And we will see progress continuing. Again, this is our expectation, but it's based on what we see in development right now in laboratories, and that's just being introduced into the market. So this is an extraordinary transformation. When new technology becomes this much cheaper, it changes the game. And so what do we see? Well, we see all of these technologies growing exponentially, just as the pattern of disruption would predict. We see it with solar power. We've seen it with wind power. Same pattern. It's the beginning of the S curve, and the same in batteries. It's the beginning of that S curve. So these are destined to be textbook cases of technology disruption. Now, what's unfortunate, what's a bit discouraging, is that this has not been widely recognized. It's not widely understood by the public. It hasn't been widely recognized by policymakers and civic leaders. It hasn't been widely recognized in industry. I'll show some information. I'm trying to be civil here and not speak ill of the incumbent energy and technology forecasting that has happened around solar, wind, and batteries. So I'll let the data speak for itself. These are the forecasts from the International Energy Agency, from from one of the world's most respected authorities on energy forecasting and the energy industry. Well, unfortunately, the energy industry has been pretty much synonymous with fossil fuels for almost a century. So it's perhaps no surprise that these projections have not been all that realistic. But you do have to wonder, I mean, if you're making the same mistake in your forecasting year after year for 20 years, when does that stop being an honest mistake? And I'll just leave it at that. This is the track record of forecasting that we see from the industry itself. Not that great. Linear projections for solar and wind, and the reality is the beginning of the exponential beginning of the S curve, right? And it's not just 1 or 2 years, it's year after year after year for 20 years now. Now, if you take these projections seriously, you're going to reach terribly misguided conclusions, right? Especially back in 2010, even in 2015. Okay. And it's not just about the projections about the new industries that are emerging, it's also projections about the old industry. So these are projections about the coal industry in the United States. Very similar kind of pattern, right? If you look back a decade, authoritative projections, in this case, this is from the US Energy Information Administration. So this is a government agency, but perhaps one that's been, has suffered a little bit from regulatory capture, let's say. This set of predictions is for the coal industry going forward. And it just is in stark denial of the reality, which is that the coal industry is in the United States, is well into collapse. The problem is that when environmental scientists and climate scientists take these kinds of forecasts, whether for the new technology or the old technology, seriously, then they can reach extremely misguided and far too pessimistic conclusions. So this is an example of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the authoritative global consensus in the climate science community. These are the energy forecasts that were made in 2014, so 8 years ago, in the 5th assessment, the previous assessment. These are their scenarios for the year 2100 for energy. I want to draw your attention to the best case scenario. This is RCP 2.6. This is, you can think of this as the best case climate change scenario, the one with the least radiative forcing. And what you see is that the assumption is that only a tiny sliver of the world's energy will come from solar and wind and geothermal power in the year 2100. That was the assumption 8 years ago. Only a tiny, tiny portion will come from those sources of energy, right? And this prediction was made in 2014, so they were projecting about 85 years ahead, right? Out to 2100. That was the assumption, and it was informed by the sorts of projections I showed on the previous slides. Very misleading, right? This is what the data actually showed at that time, right? So there's 2014, and that's the trend up until that point. Solar and wind power. That was the trend. That was what the data were showing, and the red dot over on the side shows the forecast for the year 2100. Now, what has happened in the years since publication in 2014? No points for guessing what's happened with the trend. The trend has just continued, right? So it would not have been that difficult to make a fairly accurate projection of what was going to happen over the next decade in 2014. But we didn't see that happen, and that has consequences. So this emphasizes the importance of really understanding disruption scientifically so that we can make more accurate forecasts and take those into consideration in things like our climate scenarios. Okay, very quickly. The transportation disruption. We're seeing very much the same dynamics, right? So batteries are a shared technology. Batteries are what has enabled electric vehicles to take off. Absolutely, unequivocally. We've actually had electric vehicles for more than 100 years, but they never took off because our battery technology was not good enough to give them any real range at all. That's finally changed. Finally, batteries are good enough, and electric vehicles are now ascendant. And we see this, we saw the battery adoption data with the same battery adoption data with the energy disruption, because this is shared technology between energy and transportation. But we see the same pattern with the electric vehicles themselves. We see the same general pattern, an exponential growth curve. This is global electric vehicles sold. And it's striking that this has continued through the pandemic. Right? So there are always bumps in the road. These exponential growth curves are seldom perfectly smooth, but pretty extraordinary that this has continued through the pandemic. So this is where we are today. This is where the data are today with EVs and electric vehicles versus internal combustion engine vehicles. So what should we expect going forward? Well, this is the pattern we should expect based on everything that history tells us about disruption. Okay. I'm actually going to I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to skip over very quickly the implications of automation. So once vehicles can drive themselves, that will really transform and change the way we think about our own mobility. And many of us will have the option to not even own a vehicle if transportation as a service becomes very, very, very cheap, which it's likely to once cars can drive themselves. I won't go into any more detail on that. And the only other thing to mention with transportation is that it isn't just cars. It isn't just cars that are going to go electric. Many different modes of transportation are going to go electric. And this whole space is now being flooded with billions of dollars of investment to try to drive the innovation. Everything from electric skateboards to electric buses and electric semis and electric this, that, and the other. So the electrification of transportation is bigger than just road vehicles. Okay, food, the disruption of food. Many of you may have already had an Impossible Burger. They're pretty darn good. You know, they're not perfect yet, but they're pretty darn good. It's really quite extraordinary. So let me talk just very quickly about the technologies that are behind the food disruption that's coming. The first one is precision fermentation. This is using microbes, bacteria and yeast, just like we've done for thousands of years to produce specific compounds. So we basically farm microorganisms and they output things that we like, right? So beer and bread and wine and cheese, these are things that we've produced for thousands and thousands of years. So fermentation is not new, but precision fermentation is. Precision fermentation combines precision biology, high-tech biology, with the age-old technology of fermentation. And that lets you fine-tune those microbes to produce the specific things that you want. In the case of the Impossible Burger, excuse me, it's a key protein and some molecule and other molecules that give meat its signature meaty flavors. The Impossible Burger has those materials, has those proteins produced from precision fermentation that give what is otherwise a veggie burger that extraordinarily meaty quality. So precision fermentation is an amazing new technology, and it has transformative potential. The other technology here is cellular agriculture. This is the production of meat and other animal products. You could imagine leather, for example, eggs, perhaps, with animal cells, but not the entire animal. So this goes by many different names: lab-grown meat and cell-based meat and clean meat and so forth. Cellular agriculture seems to be the term that the industry has settled on. That may change, but for now, this is what this technology is being called. These products are now available. You can get a cell ag chicken breast in a restaurant now. It's just been FDA approved in the United States, and they've been available for a little while in a few other markets like Singapore. They're still expensive, but the costs are falling very rapidly. So this is what we are going to expect to see: costs plummeting and becoming competitive with the existing products over the next 10 years or so. So like any new technology, it started out very expensive. It's getting cheaper and cheaper. I will move through this very quickly. In the early days, the very early days of this technology, it was so expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars per kilogram, that only pharmaceutical markets could support that. And insulin was a very important early example of using this technology, precision fermentation specifically. But as the technology gets cheaper, it becomes plausible to use it in new markets. Supplements were the next market, then materials and cosmetics, and finally, cheap enough for food in just in the last few years. And the costs are continuing to fall. And as the costs approach those, reach parity with those of animal bulk proteins, then that's when disruption will strike and the existing industries will face collapse under the threat of competition. Okay. This is a remarkable transformation. We've already seen it with insulin. It used to take thousands of pounds of animal pancreas to create insulin. We've transformed that completely with human insulin. Initially human insulin, and then more recently analog insulin disrupted human insulin. So we've seen this same pattern of disruption again and again. We've seen it with the precision fermentation technology already, but not in the food market, in the pharmaceuticals market. The food market is full of competitors. This is again a space that's being flooded with billions of dollars in investment. There's a massive race on to be the winners in this new industry. So progress is occurring at a breakneck pace now, and it's being driven by all of this global innovation. So I want to emphasize the just absolutely shocking, striking implications of the food disruption. And I know I'm running out of time here. I'll wrap up in just a moment. The first is that precision fermentation and cellular agriculture are just overwhelmingly more efficient processes for producing proteins and fats and sugars and other foods then using animals and their bodies as the factories for producing those molecules. It's 10 to 25 times more efficient in terms of the feedstock, what you put in, like how much sugar and how much water and how much other inputs you put into the process. It uses about 5 times less energy, the new technology does, than animal farming and livestock does. Oh, I mentioned water, 10 times less water. So much, much more water efficient, and then enormously more land efficient. Up to 100 times less land area is required to produce, say, for example, a pound or a kilogram of meat with precision fermentation or cellular agriculture than to produce it with an animal like a cow. So massive, massive transformation there. Of course, it isn't just cows. Cows are sort of in the crosshairs first, but it's dairy as well. And there are already products out on the market. You can buy precision fermentation ice cream, for example, today. Most of the world's cheese is already being used now, just over the last 10 years, with precision fermentation technology as part of the process. But it's not just cattle and beef and dairy, chickens and eggs, right? And pork and goats and sheep, so mutton and camels, which are eaten in large amounts in some parts of the world, and then of course seafood as well. So all of the animal products that we consume are in the crosshairs of being disrupted by these new technologies. They just won't be able to compete economically. The new food products will be cheaper, and not just a little bit, but a lot, half the price, a quarter of the price, a tenth of the price in some cases, and at the same level of quality, or perhaps even higher quality, because producing meat in laboratory conditions is different than producing it on a concentrated animal feedlot and in a abattoir, in a slaughterhouse. So the quality and the safety and so forth could be much, much higher as well. Not just lower cost, but also higher quality. Those two things almost always spell disruption. So what are the implications? Well, we use a huge amount of land, an absolutely staggering amount of land for animal agriculture. Most people are just not aware of how much we use it all. So this is the United States. Let me highlight the areas. This is what goes into, this is on a proportional basis, this is the amount of the continental US that's used for animal livestock production in the US. Crazy how much. So what happens when this industry is more or less wiped out? It's just relegated to a niche market, the same way that horses are for transportation are now just a tiny niche market. A few people still ride horses, but it's been relegated to a tiny niche market. Same with film cameras. Film cameras still exist and there's still enthusiasts, but it's a tiny, tiny market. What happens when that happens to animal agriculture? Well, we get all of this land back. It stops being consumed by the livestock industry and becomes available. But for what? That's the question. Imagine what we could do conservation-wise, that much land. Incredible opportunities. And globally, it's extraordinary as well. The total amount of land that will be freed up by the food disruption is equal to the United States, China, and Australia combined. That's what gets freed up over the next 20 years or so by the disruption of food by these new technologies. Absolutely incredible. Okay, so the disruption of energy, transportation, and food. These will be completely transformative. And this is why I'm so excited about the future, because 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from these three sectors of the economy. So we can transform that picture completely, absolutely completely. At the same time, we're also going to get an enormous amount of land returned for other uses that we could put to use for things like reforestation from the food disruption. That's incredible. It's more than we ever could have dreamed were possible as environmentalists. That's always been a problem. Where do we get the land to do the conservation? Where's the land going to come from? Where are we going to do the reforestation? Well, the food disruption answers part of that question. And at the same time, these disruptions, they're clean, but they'll also drive the costs down. So transportation, energy, food, they're all going to get much cheaper, because that's what disruptions do. They make everything cheaper. And as these three things become cheaper, everything gets cheaper, because it takes energy and transportation to make everything else, right? So this is why prosperity is also part of this picture. So I will stop here. I know I'm out of time. I'm extraordinarily excited about this future. I think that once you understand the implications of disruption, it becomes much more plausible to see how we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, massively reduce our footprint on the landscape, and then also have the prosperity, the economic and social prosperity, to then begin to look at our problems and say, yeah, we can tackle these. We can do it. To get our heads up, right? If we don't do it this way, if we try to cut back and degrow and regress and downsize everything, it's just going to make it that much harder to tackle these formidable challenges. So this is why I'm so optimistic. And I hope that this has been interesting, and thank you for giving me the time to share it with you.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was really interesting and inspiring. It looks like we've got a lot of really thoughtful questions going and some interesting chat conversations. So I do think that we're willing to push this a little bit over the hour mark if you have time, maybe by about 15 minutes if
sure,
needed.
Of course, absolutely.
All right, great. So I'm going to try to organize the questions, from the broader, kind of broader questions into, the more specific questions. So we have a question from Mary F. She asks, how do you define prosperity globally, including in the global South, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of different ways to look at prosperity. And we have some crude measures that they're okay, but they have their problems. The most famous of these is GDP, which is just a simple measure of productivity. It's a measure of production, and consumption goes along with production. So it's not a perfect correlation, but for the most part, we consume what we produce. If you think of the whole economy, so GDP is one important measure, but it does not capture the whole picture, and it can be perverted. You can have GDP numbers go up even in a catastrophe, and a natural disaster, for example, will drive GDP up, and that doesn't mean that natural disasters are a good thing. So we have to be very careful how we look at prosperity. But the simplest way in my mind to think about prosperity is, do individuals have freedom of choice? In other words, do they have options and opportunities available to them? That, in my mind, is probably the best way to look at prosperity. Can you do the things you want to do, lead the kind of life you want to lead, without having insurmountable obstacles in your way? And we have seen very clearly throughout history that having an abundance of energy and having material, as a society, having material wealth is absolutely crucial to creating those conditions, to creating those options for people. Societies that don't have energy abundance and societies that don't have other forms of material abundance are not able to deliver those opportunities to their citizenry. And the United States has been probably historically been the outsized success here, right? So especially in the post-war period, energy was incredibly abundant, and that was fossil fuel energy and also nuclear power, but it was cheap energy, really. And then all of the material prosperity going along with that made America rich, and then that gave so many other opportunities. Now you have to have all of the social institutions with that condition, with that material condition, to make any of it work, right? If you don't have the institutions to give people freedom of choice and give people opportunities that they can take advantage of, if you're oppressing women, if women don't have education and reproductive rights, then they can't take advantage of those opportunities, no matter how cheap energy is. And so there are a lot of social factors and conditions that also must go into the picture. But from a technological standpoint, the basic building blocks materially are very cheap energy and other forms of material abundance. Mobility is a big part of the picture, so transportation has to be there. If you're just getting everywhere on foot, you can't seize all of the opportunities you might otherwise. And you have to have good food, good nutrition, all of those sorts of things. These are the pieces of prosperity that are relevant in the conversation around these new technologies. And the last thing I'll add is that, and again, this is I go into much more detail in our work at RethinkX and then in my book, is that these technologies that are driving the disruptions, we're very fortunate that they are all inherently decentralized and also localizable and potentially democratizing. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that unlike a coal power plant, you can have a solar panel and a battery at any size and scale anywhere, and it can work. I mean, you can have a solar powered watch. I remember I had one as a kid. I had a solar powered Casio calculator watch. It seemed like it was really cool. Well, solar panels and batteries work at any scale, from literally on your wrist to gigawatts to huge solar farms and so forth. You can't wear a coal power plant on your wrist. You can't put a coal power plant on the roof of your house. A small village in the global south can't afford to put $1 billion coal power plant in to get electricity. And so that creates a massive obstacle to human development. But these new technologies are inherently much more amenable to localization than that. And that includes, for example, the food technologies. There are breweries everywhere in the world. There are breweries in small towns all over the world, including in the global south. And so, but you can't have a giant monoculture cornfield and a giant cattle ranch in every geographic location. That's too expensive. The geography won't support it everywhere. There won't, maybe not enough rainfall and so forth. And so you can't have very cheap food in every location. But precision fermentation could change that as well. So these new technologies, I'm very excited about them because they have that potential to be democratizing. It doesn't mean it will happen. It doesn't mean it will happen. We have to make good choices. We need the institutions to support those choices, but it can happen in a way that it couldn't with giant coal power plants and huge cattle farms and that sort of thing.
Wow, it's really interesting. Thank you. So we'll moving right along. We have a question from Karen. She said that she loves your perspective, and she was giving, some kind words, but she asked if there's a precedent for so many sectors changing in such a small window of time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. It's a key part of what my team at research and the research that we're doing at RethinkX, what we're trying to figure out, what we're trying to get a handle on, is the period we're entering, and we're already entering it. I should let me back up a step. These disruptions are not out there in the future, right? They've already begun. They're already happening right now. We're in the throes of these early stages now, and it may be part of why the world feels a little crazy. Obviously, there's a lot of other things going on in the world right now, but these are going to shake up the foundations of civilization, because we build civilization on the pillars of energy, transportation, food, information, and a handful of other core sectors. And so if any changes in there are a shock to the system. And so the question is, man, how do we maximize the benefits that are there, but minimize the harm along the way? And that's a crucial question. We don't have a perfect answer to that question, and the answers are not going to be the same in every location. So instead, what we tend to emphasize are that we need guiding principles. We need guiding principles to help us navigate what could be a very bumpy ride as we experience all of this transformation in a short period of time. And we've seen this historically as well. I mean, we've seen very tumultuous periods in history when disruption, for example, in the first transportation disruption, transformed the way that cities worked completely. Automobiles changed the way we thought about cities and moving around, and how we where we lived and how we worked and so forth. And that had massive implications. Okay, so we tend to offer a number of key guiding principles for how to think about navigating this in a positive way, minimize the harms along the way, and maximize the benefits. The first principle by far is to be prepared, right? So if a system shock is coming, it's going to feel much more like a total disaster and much less like an opportunity if it blindsides you, right? If you get caught unprepared by a major shock to any system, that's gonna feel a lot more like a disaster than like an opportunity. So it's fundamental, it's absolutely key that we see this stuff, we recognize what's coming, and we get ready for it, so that we can turn those potential problems and what could be disastrous into extraordinary opportunities and seize those. That's the first thing. Be prepared. The second one is that we have to start experimenting, because nobody knows. Just like, I mean, cast your mind back to 30 years ago, before the internet was a thing, right? In the mid 1990s, you could start in those early days. You could start to see, well, yeah, I mean, this is something's really extraordinary. It's happening here. A lot is going to change. It's the transformation of how we obtain information and how we communicate. That's gonna change the world. But how? What are the right ways to do that? You know, nobody knew the answers. Nobody knew exactly who the winners and losers were going to be, or what the pitfalls were going to be, or what the real opportunities were going to be in the very early days. So the key there, the next guiding principle, is we have to run experiments. We have to start experimenting, and we have to be open-minded about that. We have to learn and adapt to experiments that are run everywhere. So a success on the other side of the world or a failure on the other side of the world has to be an opportunity for us to learn from. So not only do we need to run our own experiments in our own communities and find out, what is the right way to adapt to and to adopt these new technologies. What's the right thing to do? Don't believe anybody who swoops in and tells you this is the only way to do it. This is the right way to do it. Nobody knows. What we have to do is start experimenting and learn and adapt quickly from successes and failures that we see everywhere across the entire globe. That's key. And then the third thing, the principle that's really important, is we have to protect people. People are what matter. People, communities, individuals, people are what matter, not industries and not institutions, right? Industries get disrupted, they get wiped out, they collapse. And it's the people in those industries that we have to protect, not the industries themselves, right? We don't want to bail out the coal industry. We want to bail out coal workers, right? We don't want to bail out the fossil fuel industry or prop it up. We want to protect the people in that industry. We don't want to bail out cattle farming and prop up cattle farming for 30 years when it's totally economically unviable. We want to protect the farmers. That's a crucial, crucial difference. And the industries will run all kinds of shenanigans to try to protect the companies and the businesses and the industry itself, and not necessarily the people who make up that industry. So that's a crucial thing to be on guard against. Is yes, we have to protect people instead of the industries or the institutions that they're part of, because institutions need to evolve as well. So that's how we normally frame the conversation around how should we prepare for and handle the extraordinary change that's coming.
Thank you. I think that's a nice lead into the next question. And I do want to just quickly say we will have the recording available, and we will send it out to everybody, on this webinar, everybody who registered, and you will be able to share that link. So the next question is like a 3-part question from Mary W. And I'll give you all all 3 questions, and you can answer how it makes sense. The first one is how can the build out of renewables avoid creating a spike of emissions that would send us over our tipping point? And then also, how will we find all the raw materials necessary for that, some of which are already in decline? And what will we do about the justice issues that come with mining for those raw materials?
Yeah, those are great questions. Great questions. So the first question was, what about the spike in emissions associated with the build out? And so the data on this are not completely clear yet. The data are not completely clear. But what it looks like, and what our preliminary analysis suggests, is that the greenhouse gas footprint of the build out of the new energy system and the new transportation system and the new food system is comparable to or less than the footprint of the existing incumbent industry. So for example, the total footprint of building out the energy system, the total footprint, that spike, and you only incur that spike once, and then once it's built, solar panels just run for 40 or 50 years. And wind turbines just run for 20 years, and then with a bit of maintenance will go twice that long. And batteries batteries didn't last. 10 years ago, they had a shorter lifespan. Today's batteries will run for 20 or 30 or 40 years as well. They'll degrade a little bit along the way, but by year 40, if the battery's still at 70% capacity, who cares? It's still good enough. Keep it running. So once you do the build out, that it is literally just a spike in the build out. You're not continuing to incur a footprint as you go along. That spike is comparable to or less than the ongoing footprint of fossil fuels. So it's no surprise the fossil fuel industry is making a lot of hay, trying to emphasize this issue, that if you build out renewables today, you have to use fossil fuel energy and vehicles to build solar power plants and wind turbines today, and so that will have a spike in emissions. That spike is likely to not be terribly high compared to the footprint of the existing industry, and it's only temporary. It's just for a very short period of time. And that spike may not be as high as people are imagining, because of course, as you're doing the build out, once you're halfway through building the new energy system, well, then you're going to be getting half of your energy from the clean solar panels and wind turbines to make the next solar panels and wind turbines. So it's not like you build every single last solar panel with energy from a coal plant. You do have to do that with the first solar panel you build. But the last solar panel will probably be built almost entirely with solar power. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the first thing, is that the spike is not likely to be terribly large. It will be temporary, and it's tiny compared to the long-term perpetual footprint of fossil fuels. So it's a slam dunk. It's not like an unequivocal, trade-off one against the other. That's the first thing. Now you have to remind me what the second. How come I'm blanking on what the second one was?
It was about the sourcing of raw materials.
Oh, the raw materials. Yes, that's right. That's right. So the build out will take raw materials. That's for sure. There's no question about that. There are two things to think about here. One is the scale of that endeavor, and again, it's much smaller than people imagine. So, for example, coal production, it's peaked and it's now in decline globally, or at least it looks that way. It's hard to tell because of COVID, but it looks like coal production peaked at about at between 7 and 8 billion tons of coal per year. So we were mining, effectively, we were mining coal, and we were mining 7 or 8 billion tons of coal per year. We will never mine more than a small fraction of that amount of all the material that's necessary to make solar power, wind power, batteries, electric vehicles, all of the food technologies, equipment. The total footprint of all of that will not be more than a modest fraction of the current footprint of mining coal. So that's just for context. We're not talking about a gigantic footprint for the new materials there. Now, unfortunately, some of those materials are more scarce, and some of them today are being obtained in completely unconscionable ways. The worst offender is probably cobalt, which is effectively produced, or a large fraction of the world's supply is produced by child slave labor. And this is a terrible situation. But what we have seen, the good news, that's the bad news. The good news is that what we've seen historically is that when disruptions take off, and we see all of this growth potential in a new industry, think of that feedback loop diagram I showed, the one where there's feedback loop. One of the elements of the feedback loop there is a massive increase in investment, both private and public. So the private investment, private investors, new companies are trying to jump in and get in on the game, and governments will jump in and try to support the growth of the new industry. We see that in the past, and we're seeing it today in energy and electric vehicles both, for example. And what that means is that the supply will expand. Now, there's no shortage of these materials on the Earth in general, as a general principle. There are some very conveniently located deposits of things like lithium and nickel and cobalt, but there's no shortage of those materials in general. I mean, we live on a gazillion-ton ball of rock and metal. There's lots and lots and lots of material available. The question is, where can we produce it? And does it make sense to produce it in new places where we haven't produced it in the past? Like if there's a lithium deposit in North America that is not quite as high quality as a lithium deposit in Bolivia, it hasn't made sense to utilize that before. It will start to make more and more sense to develop those material resources going forward as the new industry grows. So there's that the idea that the supply will be bottlenecked and can't support the disruption or let the industry grow as it needs to. We've not seen that happen historically. What we've seen historically and what we've seen in all the data is that the economic incentives drive the expansion of supply. The thing that we need to be concerned about is the footprint of that. And what we've also seen, unfortunately, throughout history with gold rushes of all kinds is people throwing environmental concerns to the wind and just tearing up the landscape, in a desperate, mad, gold rush kind of situation. And we need to be vigilant for that, even if it's just a spike of production, right? Again, once you build out this infrastructure, it's a spike of production. Your initial build out of all of the battery capacity and all of the solar capacity, that won't, unlike fossil fuels, which you have to keep producing every year, you don't have to do that for solar power and wind power and batteries and electric vehicles. Once you've produced all of this and built out the system, then you're just in a maintenance mode. You can recycle a lot of the material and close the loop. But even still, we could have a terrible footprint on the landscape in the build out process if we're not careful. And so this is a place to get active right now, to see this coming and to say, okay, well, we know there's going to be a huge surge in demand for nickel. And we know that some of that is going to happen in the United States. And so let's get ahead of the game there and make sure that it isn't a Wild West kind of crazy free-for-all that's unregulated. We need to get on top of that and make sure it gets done well and gets done as cleanly as possible. So that would be my response and our general response as an organization to those concerns about the footprint. Oh, and there was a third question. I probably missed that as well. What was that again?
Yeah, it was just about like the justice issues that would come with the the mining.
Right. Well, I did speak to that. Cobalt is a particularly terrible offender, and there are a lot of things that we could be doing that we aren't doing to put pressure on the international for the international community and international markets to put pressure on socially unconscionable sources of these materials. And that is that. There's no mysterious or secret method there. That takes exactly the kind of activism and advocacy that we've had to mount against all other injustices. We have to put pressure on our decision makers, on our policymakers, on our elected representatives to intervene and stop those practices, both with our votes and with our wallets. We have to do that. There's no other way to do it. And unfortunately, there are a number of examples of exploitation around the world that will continue without that kind of activism and advocacy. So there is no silver bullet, and there's no technological solution to those problems. The best and only way we know how to solve those problems is with the work that we've done in the past on other justice issues like that. That's on the development and on the supply side of things, which I think is where the question is. I also mentioned the justice dimension of the new technologies once the disruptions have unfolded, and those are very exciting to me. So the potential of these disruptions as they unfold, and then especially once they're complete, to rectify injustices worldwide, to make energy, clean energy, super cheap, affordable energy, for example, super high quality, affordable food, for example, to make those things available where they are not available today. I see enormous potential for the new technologies to do that. But that's a separate justice question from the question of what about injustice as we build out and construct this new energy and food and transportation system based on these new technologies. Those are separate things. And yeah, so while I'm very encouraged, we have to be vigilant, right? This, as I mentioned at the very beginning, these new technologies are not a magic wand, and they could have a lot of, there could be a lot of harm and tumult along the way if we're not careful.
Thank you. We have, several more questions, but I think we only have time for one more. So I think it'll be a good one, to close it out. John had mentioned that the political climate where he lives is very anti-renewable, very pro-fossil fuels. So how can governmental resistance to virtuous cycle disruption be overcome?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The one of the things that I discuss at some length in my book is that we have to focus on the new technologies as win-wins, right? The new technologies offer solutions that can get lots of different people excited, right? They have a lot to offer, lots of different stakeholders. There's a lot to like around these new technologies, but we have to find that common ground. And we all know that environmental issues, environmental concerns are politically divisive, especially in the United States. That's not the case across the whole world, but it's certainly the case in the US. And so the question is, how do you find a common ground? How do you focus on what are win-wins? In my experience and in my view, I think that probably some of the very best potential for finding common ground and getting those who are politically opposed today to trying to tackle environmental problems like climate change is to get them focused on the economic benefits of the new technologies, of the disruptions. So one of the things that's most exciting about these new technologies as disruptions is that they do not cost money, they save us money. Right? That's very, very important to understand. Right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, if we wanted to build solar power, we were losing money doing that because it was much cheaper in 2005 and 2010 to build a coal power plant. And so if you built solar panels, as California did, for example, it was a losing proposition. You were losing money that way. And not everybody was happy to see, for example, tax dollars going into that expenditure. But that was then. Today, there's no compromise like that. There's no win-lose sort of trade-off. It's a win-win. You save money because solar power is much cheaper to generate electricity than a coal power plant. In fact, today, solar power is so cheap that it's cheaper to build a new solar plant and get electricity that way than to keep operating an old coal power plant. In other words, the coal itself, even if the coal power plant were free, it still wouldn't make sense to use it because it's more expensive to run it than to just build a new solar power plant. Okay, so the economics have changed completely. That is fundamental because what that means is, and it's crucial to get that message across, that we are no longer incurring a big overhead cost to adopt these new technologies. And disruptions don't happen when that's the case. Disruptions only occur when the new technologies are much cheaper and outcompete the older ones. That's why they happen. Digital cameras never would have taken off if they were twice as expensive as film cameras and never got any cheaper. Digital cameras obliterated film cameras because they're so much cheaper, right? That's why that happened. And that's the case for all disruptions. Well, that's what's going to happen with clean energy, with clean transportation, with clean food. It's just going to be so much cheaper. Okay, so that's the first thing, is that we're not talking about paying a massive green premium for this. We can save money in the process. That's the first economic piece that needs to be part of the conversation to find common ground. The second piece is jobs. Jobs, absolutely jobs. If you look at the Bureau of Labor statistics in the US, the fastest growing jobs on the top 10 or 15 or top 20 list, solar power installation, wind power installation, those are always in the top 10 right now. Massive job growth in those industries. So we need to emphasize that these new industries, and it's not just the energy, it's also the transportation, electric vehicles, all the charging, all the batteries we have to make. It's also the food disruption. There are huge job opportunities there, right? Just like the internet created huge, explosive new job opportunities, jobs that never existed before, millions of them. Right? In 1992, we're almost in 2023, but in 1992, so 30 years ago, there were how many jobs were there related to the internet? Only a tiny handful, right? But the internet created huge numbers of new jobs, massive new economic opportunity, a huge amount of new value for society, some downsides too. I mean, you know, the internet has its faults, but there was massive economic opportunity there. Well, it's going to be the same when it's inevitably going to be the same when you disrupt other segments of the economy as well. Other big sectors of the economy, like energy, like transportation. So those are the things that we need to focus on, right? That the economics, the common ground is, number one, this isn't going to cost us money, it's going to save us money. All of this stuff, this is an investment. It's an investment. And the sooner we make that investment, the sooner we start saving money. And then the second thing is we can create huge numbers of jobs with these disruptions over the next 20 years. Huge numbers. There are way more jobs in solar and wind installation than there are in coal mining, or ever were in coal mining in the last few generations. And so we have to focus on those things if we're going to find common ground, in my view. Now, there are other things to focus on, health and clean air and those sorts of things. There are other things to focus on, but man, do those shared economic priorities resonate across the board. That is where I think it's possible to find real common ground. And so that's what I think that should be the top of our list to focus on for collaborating and coming together across political lines and across economic lines, all of the things all of the ways in which our society is divided. We can come together around the economic benefits of these new technologies.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn it to Bridget to, close us out. But thank you so much for that. And I'm going to pop the link to pre-order your book into the chat. It's going to come out on Monday. Right now, I think it's only showing up to pre-order for Kindle, but it will be available in all forms on Monday.
That's right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Adam, for this exciting new perspective. And thank you for everyone who got on and stayed on late with us and for all the great questions. As Molly mentioned, we'll be sharing a recording of the video and all the relevant links shortly. So thank you all.